SEP Fanfic Readings presents 1,000 Words by Olive Juice 28. Chapter 50. Miscommunications. The sound of Hermione racing down the steps finally caught Draco's attention, but by the time he turned around, she was gone, and it took a moment for her broken words to register. Once they did, a look of pure horror spread across his face as he realized what she thought he'd meant, and he sprinted for the stairs, hoping to catch up to her. When he reached the bottom of the steps, however, the corridor stretched out before him completely empty. Assuming she must have made a beeline back to the room, he took off in that direction, running full out, his knuckles bleeding, his face flushed, not caring who saw him. He burst through the doors and looked frantically around, but didn't see her chaotic curls anywhere. Padma and Anthony were just setting up a game of chess and looked up curiously at his hasty entrance. "Have you seen Hermione?" he gasped, slightly winded from his chase. "No," Padma replied, a frown creasing her brow, while Anthony shook his head in a negative response as well. "Everything okay?" "Not really," Draco sighed. "I'm going to see if I can find her." He started backing out the door. "If you see her, tell her to stay here until I get back. Please." "You might want to take care of that," Anthony nodded to Draco's bruised and bloodied knuckles. He'd barely registered the injury, and as he took stock of the damage, Padma swiftly approached him, took his hand in hers, and waved her wand over it. The bleeding stopped, the skin began to repair itself, and the throbbing he was just now aware of receded. "Thanks," he muttered sheepishly, and she simply nodded and gave him a small smile before returning to her seat. At that, he turned and made his way back out of the room, his friend staring at him with concern. Unsure where to look next, he stopped to consider her usual patterns. The only time he'd ever seen her upset, she'd been in the room. But he also knew she found comfort in the library. He decided that would be his next stop. Unfortunately, she wasn't there either. He scoured the vast space, checking every alcove and nook, even glancing into the restricted section, but came up empty-handed. He politely asked Madame Pince if she had seen Hermione, but the severe witch simply shook her head and pinned him with a stern glare. He checked Bill's office and chambers, their history of magic classroom, the potions dungeon, and even the outdoor room the birthday party had been in. Nothing. By then he was completely winded and very discouraged, and afraid that his chances of fixing this were diminishing with every passing second. He trudged through the entrance hall, not even bothering to check the courtyard, because he knew the last place she would go when she was upset would be back into a crowd of people. He strode down to their favorite spot on the edge of the lake, and scanned the entire bank for a sign of her, but to no avail. He doubted she'd go to the Quidditch pitch, but he checked there just in case. On his way back, he saw the familiar plume of smoke coming from Hagrid's hut, and decided to pay the gamekeeper a visit. His knock on the worn wooden door was answered almost immediately. "Malfoy, what can I do for you?" Hagrid's booming voice welcomed him as he stood aside and gestured for Draco to enter. "Thanks, Hagrid. He faltered under the watchful eye of the half-giant, knowing Hermione was one of his favorites, and he didn't know if he'd be willing to help him. He soldiered on nonetheless. "I'm looking for Hermione." Hagrid's eyes widened in surprise as they both took seats at his large kitchen table. "Hermione? Wasn't she at the ceremony and all?" "Yes, she was." Draco nodded and steeled himself to explain the whole disaster. "Afterwards, we were in the courtyard, and there was an incident with another guest." Hagrid sucked in a sharp breath, and Draco couldn't bring himself to look him in the eye. "I reacted badly. When she found me a short while later, we had a misunderstanding, and now I can't find her anywhere." Silence met his explanation, and he slowly raised his head to meet the kind, dark eyes that were studying him intently. "What happened?" "A former student, Smith I think his name was, made some comments to me, and then to her when he figured out she was with me. Other people got involved, and he went off on a vile tirade. Not that he didn't expect it or don't deserve it, but—" Hagrid interrupted him. "You're not deserving of nothin' he was sayin', and don't you think otherwise. You've done more since the war than most. There's lots to be said about admitting you're wrong and trying to change. More than thinking you're right and not helping at all." Hagrid nodded fiercely, indicating Draco should continue. "Well," he took a deep breath, his cheeks now blazing from the unexpected compliments, "I took off, and had to get away before I did or said something to make it worse. Hermione found me, of course, and she was trying to talk sense, but I was just ranting, and she misunderstood what I was saying. She thought that I was talking about her, but I wasn't." He dropped his face into his hands, his heart clenching at the wounded tone of her voice before she'd fled. I need to apologize to her." His voice came out in a strangled plea, but he didn't even care. All he wanted was to find her and make things right. Hagrid seemed to understand because he nodded and patted Draco on the shoulder, causing the chair beneath him to creak precariously. "I'm sure you'll patch it up all right. Hermione's not one to hold grudges, and she loves your summit fierce, so I reckon it'll be all right in no time." Hearing Hagrid's take on his witch both soothed his frayed nerves and made him feel worse at the same time. "I hope so. I never meant to hurt her." His eyes started to sting, and he felt mere inches away from breaking down completely. "Don't worry, Malfoy. It'll work out. Our golden girl can be a little sensitive sometimes, but her heart's in the right place, and she'll see the truth of it. She'll forgive you." Hagrid smiled kindly, and he shoved his chair back from the table, startling Draco with the abrupt movement. "Usually I'd ask her to stay for tea, but I'm thinking you best get back up to the castle and find your witch." Draco nodded vigorously and stood as well. "Thanks, Hagrid." "A wise man once told me there's no sense in waiting on everyone to like you. It's not going to happen." A smile crinkled the gamekeeper's eyes. "Those that know you and care about you are what matters. The rest can go jump in the lake." His deep chuckle rumbled through the cabin, and Draco heard the truth of his words. He nodded again, his throat too thick for speech, and took off for the castle at a run as evening darkened his return journey. As he neared the entrance hall, he tried to think about where Hermione might have gone. He knew he could always go back to the room and wait for her, but he really wanted to see her as soon as possible. As he started up the marble stairs, he saw Malcolm coming in the opposite direction. "You haven't by any chance seen Hermione, have you?" he asked the young Gryffindor. Malcolm's eyes narrowed, and he scowled at Draco, which surprised the older wizard, as he usually got along just fine. "Why?" Malcolm asked, his voice hard and unfriendly. Draco was far past the point of being embarrassed by his mistakes and blurted out honestly. "I was an arse, and I said some things I shouldn't have. I need to find her so I can apologize." Malcolm seemed to size him up for a moment, thankfully deciding the former Slytherin meant what he said. "Saw her a few hours ago. She's in Gryffindor Tower." "Really?" Draco was slightly surprised. "Yeah, saw her going up to the girls' dorm with Ginny Weasley. She was crying." He continued to frown at his flying instructor, clearly finding fault with him at the moment, which Draco felt he had every right to. "Thanks, Malcolm." He clapped the boy on the shoulder and gave him a sincere nod. "I owe you one." As he hurried away, the younger boy's voice trailed after him. "You better not break her heart." "Merlin, I hope not." When Draco reached the portrait of the fat lady, he realized he had no means of entering the dorm. He fervently hoped it wouldn't be long before someone came along, but it seemed the founders were smiling upon him in his fretful state. He had only been pacing the corridor for a minute or two when the portrait hole opened and Andrew appeared, his eyes widening as he took in the unexpected presence of his flying instructor. "Wait!" Draco cried, reaching out to keep the door from swinging shut. "I need to get in there. I need to find—" But his words trailed off as a scowling redhead emerged from the dorm. "What are you doing here, Malfoy?" Ginny's voice was cold and completely void of the friendly snark she'd usually directed at him. Andrew, sensing that this was not something he needed to be an audience to, quietly slipped away. Draco sighed and ran a hand through his hair. He knew the only way he was going to gain access to Hermione was by convincing one of the fiercely protective best friends that he wasn't the complete and total bugger he probably seemed at the moment. "I need to talk to Hermione, please." "She's asleep, after crying herself sick. I'm not inclined to wake her up, only to have you upset her further." Draco felt the blood rush from his face. The thought that he'd caused such distress to the girl who meant the world to him made him feel ill. He needed to explain what happened. Not wanting to be overheard by random students, he gestured down the hall. "Could we talk somewhere?" Grudgingly, Ginny nodded, her arms folded tightly across herself as she walked alongside him. Neither spoke for several long minutes, him because he didn't know where to start, and her because she wasn't about to make this easy for him, not after the state her closest friend had shown up in. "I've made a sodding mess of things," Draco finally groaned out when they reached the end of a long and rarely traveled corridor. He sank onto a stone bench in an alcove that sported a window overlooking the Black Lake. He scrubbed his face with his hands and looked at Ginny, who was still standing in a defensive posture nearby. He cocked his head towards the bench in invitation. "You can sit. I won't bite." She huffed loudly and sat as far away from him as possible, angling herself so he could clearly see the glare she'd been sending him since they first set off. "I'm sure Hermione told you what I said, or rather, what she thinks I said. But you have to believe me, Ginny. I didn't mean it the way she took it. It was a simple misunderstanding. He slumped back against the stone wall and looked up at the ceiling. I reacted badly to Smith in the courtyard, and I was just ranting, to myself mostly. And she picked up on part of it and thought I was talking to her. He turned pleading slate-gray eyes on the fierce redhead. You have to understand. But she cut him off. No, Malfoy. She shook her head and pinned him with an accusatory stare. You need to understand a few things about our Hermione before you can even begin to try and fix this. Draco's heart gave a small leap of hope at her use of the word our, praying that meant that there was still a chance she was his. Hermione may come across as a paragon of self-confidence and assurance, but there's a level of insecurity beneath it all that she's been battling with her whole life. Ginny sighed, resigning herself to the fact that she was going to have to lay it all out for the forlorn-looking wizard beside her. She's always had to prove herself, had to show others she measured up, that she belonged. Draco's brows furrowed, and he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, watching her intently. When she was in primary, she wasn't friendly enough or playful enough to fit in with the other kids. They made fun of her for liking books and learning, more than dolls and games. When she came to Hogwarts, she wasn't magical enough to meet the standards some deemed most important. She paused here, a sharp eyebrow raised at the young man next to her. Draco lowered his head into his hands, knowing exactly what Ginny meant, and his heart dropped to his shoes as he remembered how cruel and awful he had been to Hermione back then. As memories flooded his mind, the youngest Weasley continued. Magical ability aside, she still struggled to connect with the other witches in her year. She wasn't girly enough to hang out with her dorm mates, and she definitely felt like she wasn't pretty enough for Ron to notice her or ask her to the Yule Ball. Ginny snorted at that and muttered something about her idiot brother before forging ahead. Even with all her incredible skills and abilities, she came out of the war feeling like she hadn't done enough. That maybe if she'd been smarter or quicker or braver, that more people could have been saved. That maybe Harry could have put an end to it sooner if she had been able to figure it out. At this point, Ginny's voice wavered and Draco's own throat was tight. Hermione has struggled with not being enough for years, and in pretty much every area of her life. She's come a long way, especially this year. But for her to hear you say that, or to think that's what you were saying, it brought back a world of hurt. The young witch sniffed and wiped her eyes with the cuff of her sleeve, and she observed the former Slytherin. His head was still in his hands, his shoulders slumped, and a general air of defeat hung around him. I never meant for her to take it that way. Draco's voice was muffled as his hands were still covering his face. I wasn't listening to anything she was saying. I barely even realized she was standing there. I was so caught up in my own humiliation. He sat up and turned to Ginny, his eyes shining with unshed tears, his voice hoarse with emotion. If anyone doesn't measure up, it's me. I have nothing to offer her except a tarnished reputation and a despised family name. I was frustrated by the thought that nothing I do will ever be enough to completely erase that. He yanked up his sleeve and thrust his arm into her line of sight, the faded dark mark still visible on his pale skin. He sighed heavily. I need to fix this, Gin. I need to make it right. Do you think she'll ever forgive me? Ginny studied him and saw the sincerity in his eyes, heard the misery behind his words, and knew that for as much of a poncy prat as he used to be, Draco Malfoy was a completely different person these days, and he clearly loved her friend. She also knew how much he had done since his release from Azkaban to try to right the wrongs of his past, and she respected him greatly for it. She nodded. Hermione is the most forgiving person I have ever met. She's just hurt right now, but she'll give you a chance to explain. You need to give her time, though, and let her come to you when she's ready. He nodded, willing to accept any stipulations at that point. Ginny stood, and her voice was much kinder than before. I'll send her back to the room when she's awake and feels up to it. Make sure you're there. She placed her hand on his shoulder for a second and gave it a small squeeze. For the record, you've done more than enough to show the world you've changed. Don't let prats like Smith take that away from you. With that, she set off in the direction of Gryffindor Tower once more. Draco remained on the stone bench for a few moments, turning Ginny's words and explanation over in his mind. He'd had no idea his beautiful, brilliant, and all-around wonderful witch would ever doubt herself like that, and hated that he had played a part in making her do so. Determined to be ready and waiting whenever she decided to return, he stood and headed off at a brisk pace back to the room. Upon returning, he found the common area completely empty, a low fire burning in the hearth. He decided to shower and change in an attempt to look more put together than he felt, and once that was done, he settled himself into one of the squashy chairs in front of the flames, quill and parchment in hand. There were so many thoughts swirling around his head. He needed to get them out, and figured this would be as good a way as any to pass the time until she came back. Several hours later, but still long before the sun would rise, the door to the room opened quietly, and Hermione stepped inside. At first, she didn't think anyone was around, but as her eyes adjusted to the darkened space, she recognized a familiar figure sitting in front of the fireplace. She approached cautiously, and realized as she got nearer that he was asleep. He was slumped in the chair, his cheek resting on one fist that was propped up by an elbow. On the floor beside him, several pieces of parchment had been crumpled and tossed aside, and on the small table next to him one other piece lay flat with a quill and inkpot resting there as well. She leaned over slightly and saw her name on top of the page, and understood that he had been writing to her, waiting for her to return. She studied the pale blonde before her heart constricting and her eyes prickling with more tears. Ginny had told her he'd sought her out, and had shared just enough of their interaction to let her know that he felt miserable about the whole thing, and he had never intended to hurt her. She knew that now, truth be told. A small part of her knew that even when she fled the tower after hearing his harsh words, but she was so overcome with that horrible, painfully familiar feeling of inadequacy that she couldn't find the wherewithal to be rational. She'd felt like her heart had shattered, and the idea of losing Draco had literally made her sick. Ginny had been equal parts worried about her and furious with the wizard who had caused her distress. It had been unnecessary, though. She knew he'd never intended to make her feel that way, never meant those words to pierce her heart. She yearned to reach over and brush back the shock of white blonde hair that hung over his eyes, but she didn't want to startle him, and was more than a little nervous about facing him after their first official fight since they'd been together. She scooted the other armchair across from his a little closer and curled up in it, deciding to wait there until he woke. She didn't have to wait long. Within a handful of minutes, he stirred and slowly opened his eyes. He froze when he spotted her sitting across from him and blinked a few times, making sure he still wasn't asleep and dreaming. She had her knees pulled up in front of her, arms wrapped around them tightly, almost as if protecting herself. The thought that she felt like she needed to be wary of him felt like a punch to his gut, and it took several hard swallows for him to make sure that he wasn't going to be sick. She didn't look angry, and she wasn't crying. She was simply watching him with a mildly guarded expression. He shifted so that he was on the edge of his chair, leaning towards her with his arms resting on his knees. He wanted so badly to reach out and take her hand, but he knew he hadn't earned it yet. "I'm so glad you're back," he started, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to explain. I never meant. I'm just so sorry, Hermione." He couldn't hide the quavering of his voice or the sheen of tears that blurred his vision, but he didn't care. This wasn't about him saving face. This was about fixing the mess he'd created and getting her to understand that his world was meaningless without her. He swiped at his eyes and saw that her own were glassy as well, though her expression had softened a little. "The things I was saying up there, they weren't about you. None of it was about you. Please believe that." He looked imploringly at her and was immensely relieved when she nodded, even though she'd started chewing on her bottom lip. "I was embarrassed by the scene in the courtyard, that you had to witness that. It was humiliating and frustrating, and—" He sighed and dropped his gaze to the carpet between them. "I just felt like nothing I had done, or will ever do, would be enough to wipe away the stain of being on the wrong side." He lifted his head again and met her chocolate orbs, still swimming with tears, but now filled with understanding and sorrow. "You were right. It shouldn't matter what others think of me, but it's hard to shake that off sometimes. I think I'm getting better at it, but today was definitely not one of my finer moments." He scowled at his bruised knuckles before looking at her again. "Nothing is more important to me than you. Not my name, or my reputation, or my place in Wizarding Society. Nothing." He reached over and picked up the parchment on the table and held it out to her. "I wrote this after I spoke to Ginny. I'd like you to read it, since I'll probably muck it up if I try to say it all out loud." He gave her a small, lopsided smile and held his breath as she glanced down at the paper and back up at him. She took it from him gently and loosened her posture slightly as she settled in to read his words. "Dearest Hermione, I am so sorry. I don't know where to begin or how to explain how awful I feel about hurting you, but I need you to believe me that it was never my intent. I'm just so very sorry. I'm rubbish at this sort of thing. You know that all too well by now, but I'm going to try to put my thoughts and feelings into words to help you understand how much you mean to me. I never, ever want you to doubt my love for you, or my faith in you, or the value I place on our relationship. You are everything I have ever dreamed of, everything I never thought I could have, everything I will ever need or want. You are more than enough, so much more. You are more compassionate and tender-hearted than anyone I have ever known. Your kindness knows no bounds, and your desire to help others, to make this world a better place, is humbling and inspiring. You are more intelligent than probably 95% of the people working at the ministry, and could best them in any subject. Your ability to take information, to understand things, and to help others grow in their own understanding is a gift. You are more magically powerful than most fully qualified witches and wizards, and your ability to harness and yield that power is terrifying, if I'm being honest. I hope to never find myself on the wrong end of your wand, yet I know you would never use your innate talents to harm others. You are more beautiful than any other witch I have ever laid eyes on. I know you don't believe me when I say that, but it is true. Your curls are the softest things I've ever touched. Your lips are the sweetest I've ever tasted, and your nose is the most adorable one on the planet. Your eyes are overwhelming. They're a window to your incredible soul, and I could get lost in them for days. You are perfect in every way. You are more patient and understanding than a saint. Your well of tolerance must be endless, because I have never seen you lose your temper with someone who wasn't as quick on the uptake as you. Your willingness to help your friends with whatever they bring to you is enviable, and it's no wonder you are so highly regarded by everyone who crosses your path. You are more forgiving than I will ever deserve. The fact that you welcomed me to your table last summer is a testament enough, but that I earned your pardon is something I will treasure forever. Knowing that you are able to look past who I was, and that you've been willing to give who I am trying to be a chance, means more to me than you could possibly know. If anyone doesn't measure up in this relationship, it's abundantly clear that it is not you. I will never be able to fathom what I did to earn a second chance from you. And I do know, but that after spending these past few months with you, I can't imagine my life without you in it. I hope to Merlin I don't ever have to. I never meant to hurt you, and I swear on everything I have, everything I am, that I didn't mean these things the way you took them. I'm sorry my anger got the best of me, and I didn't stop to think about what I was saying. I'm sorry you bore the brunt of my own hurt and shame. I'm just so sorry. Please forgive me. I love you. Draco. Several tears splashed onto the parchment as she read, and when she reached the end, she took a deep, shuddering breath. She believed his words, and knew his heart, and was so overwhelmed with the emotions his sentiments stirred that she didn't know how to respond. She raised her eyes and found his pewter gaze pinned on her, desperation and longing clearly etched on his handsome face. He hadn't moved a single inch since handing her the letter, and seemed almost afraid to disturb the air around them. She moved to set her feet on the floor so she could lean forward, closing some of the distance between them. He watched her carefully, and her heart clenched at the fearful expression that came over him, almost as if he was expecting the worst. While she knew there were so many things to be said, she started with the most important. I love you too. In an instant he was out of his chair and kneeling in front of her, his hands clasping her own, his eyes red-rimmed and shining. I am so sorry, he began, but she placed a finger on his lips to stop him. I know. It wasn't all your fault, and of course I forgive you. She smiled and leaned forward to kiss him softly. He returned the kiss almost timidly, and then wrapped her tightly in his embrace, burying his face in her curls and treasuring the feel of her in his arms. Though it had only been half a day since the whole ordeal had occurred, it felt like ages since he'd held her, and the terrifying possibility that she might not want him anymore made it an even more desperate reunion. In one swift motion, he scooped her up so she was sitting on his lap as he settled himself into her chair. She giggled at his maneuvering, and he hugged her even tighter, pressing his lips to her head as she snuggled into his arms. After a few minutes of blissful silence, during which both of their hearts were able to return to normal rhythms after the emotional hippogriff ride the day had been, Hermione spoke. I'm sorry, too, she said in a small voice. What in Salazar's name for? For jumping to such an awful conclusion, for letting my emotions get the better of me. It wasn't your fault. Not at all. Draco shifted so she could see his face as he spoke. I should have reined in my temper. Should have been more aware of what you were trying to say. She shook her head resolutely, her curls tickling his face in the process. I still should have been less assuming. I normally think pretty rationally, but... He cut her off. Rational? You. Never. His teasing earned him a playful poke in the ribs as she continued. When it comes to you, I get overwhelmed easily, and it just was too much after the service and everything. She shrugged, unable to clearly explain what was going on in her brain at the time, but he honestly didn't need her to. Truly, Hermione, it wasn't your fault. I'm just sorry it happened at all. I'm sorry I ruined our afternoon. You did not ruin our afternoon, she looked at him sternly. That fault lies solely with that obnoxious wanker Zachariah Smith, who apparently slipped on a very large patch of mud and thestral dung as he made his way back to the apparition point, or so I've been told. She smirked devilishly, and he couldn't help but laugh. And who exactly told you that? Well, Ginny told me, but George and Thea were the ones who apparently saw it. Oh, did they? Just happened to be nearby to witness his demise. His brow cocked in teasing disbelief. Of course, she smiled sweetly. Perfectly minding their own business. They exchanged knowing glances and promptly burst into laughter, both extremely happy to be exactly where they were, and putting the day's events behind them.